Taking a closer look at Silo Season 2, Episode 6, Barricades, and Episode 7, The Dive. Starting with, we do not know why we are here. Knox and Shirley are going to need to stay together and make sure that the Down Deep feels as secure as possible if they want to continue surviving in this world. Episode 6's big trial is going to be figuring out who poisoned the food and securing food from now on for the Down Deep. And they manage that by attacking the blockade and pushing it up to floor 120 because there is a farm on 122. So now the Down Deep has farm access, and it's not as simple as cutting off food supply and poisoning what they have left. And episode 7 starts them off with hiding for their lives as Judicial has told their listeners to go ahead and kill these two. And they're sort of trying to figure out who the listeners are, who might carry this out, but also who initially poisoned the food in the Down Deep, since that was a huge issue for them. When they figure out it's a cafeteria worker, Knox shows the key difference between him and Bernard, where Bernard leads with fear and a stranglehold that people feel like they can't resist. Knox leads with understanding and care. He fosters an environment of openness. And I think this is going to really build and cement loyalty and also encourage people to come to him in the future instead of just doing whatever it is Judicial demands or else. And lastly, Shirley and Knox sort of further their campaign by launching a rocket up in the silo that releases all these papers, blaming IT for the whole situation, further turn off the power to illuminate the fact that IT still maintains power even when the engine isn't going. Meanwhile, Walker has sort of split off onto her own personal journey that's really about trying to save Carla, and she did bring it up to Knox and Shirley, but unfortunately I'm not sure they understood what Walker could or couldn't do to achieve this goal or how important Carla was to her, because they kind of brush her off in the face of these larger issues, which forces Walker to go alone, and she ends up turning on a camera briefly to get in touch with IT that way and perhaps broker her own deal. But we know whatever deal she comes to is not going to be good for the rest of the Down Deep, so it's something we'll have to watch to see if she goes through with it for Carla's sake, if she goes to Knox and Shirley one more time. It's throwing a wrench in what could have otherwise been a very smooth take for engineering. Billings also puts in a lot of work here. He ends up healing Kennedy and then becoming a significantly more intimidating and threatening sheriff when Kennedy refuses to share what he knows. And with the information that Kennedy has, combined with his suspicions about the circumstances Jules had to go outside and his already fermenting suspicions about whatever Sims and Bernard are doing, he ends up locating both Knox and Shirley, talking to Bernard on the radio, and demanding an investigation into Meadows' death before he'll take these two into custody. He's able to blast all these suspicions over the radio waves before Bernard shuts it down, which means in theory everyone in the sheriff's department heard it. And it also is putting us closer and closer to that Silo 17 situation where engineering and the sheriff department are aligned. An additional little note here is that Billings is kind of unsure about what he's doing or how best to proceed going forward, but it's then that his wife points out that he no longer has the shakes from the syndrome, and he hasn't even been taking his medicinal herbs on the regular, which has me thinking back to a moment where the sheriff's secretary went from living up top to going back to the lower levels, and she said she always felt watched up there. Might have been an indication that there are just more cameras up top, but I think it might also indicate that if they are putting something in the water, it's significantly stronger up top than it is in the Down Deep, and maybe the syndrome is actually a side effect of whatever those chemicals are instead of an actual disease. Bernard's larger goal seems set entirely on figuring out what this secret coded message is. It's like he doesn't even care about the fermenting rebellion, or maybe he feels completely powerless with the directions the Order has given him. But it is kind of interesting to see this side of him in the silo where his curiosity is driving him more than his cold ruthlessness or his demand to maintain order. And that kind of rolls me into Lucas, who is Bernard's vehicle for figuring this information out. I think he's an interesting character because he has that same curiosity and hunt for truth that other characters have had, but he is willing to do anything and team up with anyone to get that information. Where Jules and the sheriff have always been sort of hesitant to go to Judicial or to work through IT, and I think if they had been offered this kind of alliance, they'd have probably shied away from it. So I'm wondering if, even though we're bolstering the idea that searching for truth and being curious and inquisitive is a highly positive trait within the world of the Silo, Lucas is here specifically to remind us that curiosity also killed the cat, and that sometimes you're so busy trying to figure out whether or not you can, you never stop to think about whether or not you should. And I know that's a little unfair to Lucas because his situation is such that he either goes along with what Bernard wants or he goes back to the mines, but he is so excited and so into it here, I have to assume he's all the way bought in. And that brings me to Rob and Camille Sims. I'm gonna sort of pair them up as a unit, because even though the two of them were sort of working in opposite ends, briefly in episode 5, when Rob finds out about this and confronts Camille, they realign to be a unified front. And I think the same way that Walker is sort of a wild card for the engineering play, Rob and Camille are going to be a huge stumbling block for Bernard, and it's a little bit of a game of chicken to see which one of the two of them make a chaotic move first. Something that's become really clear to me is even though Rob seems to be like caught on this noble idea of order and what's best for the silo, Camille is really only in it for a grab for power. And it seems like she doesn't care where that power comes from or what that does to the other members of the silo. It's also an interesting demand to sort of like work into the framework of the silo, because up until now it's pretty much been about like truth and secrets and deception and all that kind of stuff. And like arguably Bernard has more information than anyone else and maintains that information for control. So I guess it's sort of always been hovering at the peripheral edges. But like our main characters like Jules or the sheriff or even Billings to a certain extent aren't doing things for control. They're looking just for truth and knowledge and more information to make more informed decisions. Camille and Rob are more baldly just looking for power, and I don't think they care about truth or more informed decisions or knowledge. They're just looking for where they can hitch their wagon to come out on top. Which rolls us right into Silo 17. There's not a lot of development on Solo. He healed Jules' up, but in the process of doing that took her suit to sort of force her to fix his silo, which aligns with what he said his duty has been this whole time, which is to preserve the IT vault. I am curious about why he's so determined to do that, given that we know he's not the original IT guy and he's not the Shadow. Jules has to shift her priority from going back to Silo 17 to going underwater, which she completes here at the end of episode 7. Solo got abducted by some unknown third party, and that sort of like made her mission to find Solo now so that she can finally get her suit and go back to 18. We do not know who built the silo. There's not a ton of information here that we didn't already suspect. Like, we do actually get to see what's inside the IT vault, and then on one side there's like a bed and its own separate rations, and on the other side is a library and paintings, both like digital and hard copies. More than any single IT Shadow could ever read in their lifetime, which means that there's actually pretty good ability for each IT person to have their own deviation. It's very interesting because it seems like Bernard really wanted Meadows to do things exactly his way or to get out. If Bernard can be trusted, even though there is all this extra information inside the IT vault, there's still no explanation for why we're in the silo, which is kind of interesting because minimally he knows there are other silos out there. So it'll be interesting to see if Bernard is just keeping things close to his chest or if he really doesn't know why we're here. We also got some reason to doubt this memory drug again, besides the fact that it just seems sort of absurd and it was just something Gloria threw out there and then Rob followed up with later. Because even though Rob mentioned it to Kennedy, it's obvious that he never intended to give that drug to him. Either means that he realized, oh, racing 20 years was too much for the drug, or it would be preposterous, there'd be other issues like why is he so old if he doesn't remember 20 years? Or maybe this drug doesn't exist at all? I don't know. I really can't tell if there is a memory drug and if it is in the water, because there seems to be like equal amounts of weak evidence for and against this claim at this juncture. There's also a lot more mystery going on in Silo 17 because there is a survivor or maybe another person from outside who came into the silo, and we don't know like how many survivors are there in 17. We don't know if this person was in the vault with Solo or if they were living outside of the vault and just like scrounging, or maybe like Julia, they came in from the outside. And of course we don't really know why they're so hostile. Like if they came in from the outside, it makes no sense. If they were living in the vault with Solo, it doesn't really seem to add up to me. Like they might be angry or disagree with how Solo is dealing with Julia, but they probably wouldn't like shoot an arrow at him and an axe and all of that. And if they've just been like watching this whole time that he's been wandering around with Jules, why make the move now? And of course I don't feel like we got any extra information on why the outside is the way it is or whether or not it's safe to go outside, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. I would have thought our world would have expanded a little bit more outside of the silos since we're juggling two silos. There's this whole outside gap in between them, but it seems like we're really hunkering down deeper into the lore of what made these things and why they are the way they are. And then like a little note I'm keeping that I don't quite have a place for is Billings' wife and Pete Nichols are in the Down Deep, and I think it's just important to remember where all our key players' positions are when we have a barricade in Silo 18. This show is still really awesome. It's got great acting, great set design, a fun plot, lots of little lore and mystery key points. If I were like a little bit more into code breaking and ciphering, I think I'd be even more excited this season than I am just generally. But I think it's a great show, and if you have even a little bit of interest in dystopias, post-apocalypse, or science fiction, then this is something you should be watching. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you think of episode 6 and 7? And as always, keep reading.